Hello, world historians. We're continuing with the theme of the Black Death because it is one of the great moments of world history. I think this brief window in the mid 1300s to 14th century when everything seemed to be swept aside, where the world itself seemed to be almost at an end. But I think more important or even more interesting to consider than the Black Death, as gruesome as it was the wake of the plague and the world that it created in its aftermath. And we're dealing with things here such as the collapse of empires, particularly the Mongol Empire, the kind of scapegoating of certain specific groups within society because of the perceived lack of understanding of the root origins of the plague. And I'm thinking, for example, of the persecution of Jews in Europe, and also the appearance of regime change, which you find particularly in Asia with the collapse of the Mongol Empire, or the Yuan Dynasty as it was known in China, and its replacement by the Ming Dynasty, an ethnic Chinese dynasty. So these are all significant factors. I'm just starting with a map, however, because it shows that the plague is still present, if not prevalent, in the modern world. And the reason we don't hear more about the plague, and you can see these red areas here, this isn't by any means, I think, a comprehensive map because it includes areas of the world where there's little medical information. But those red areas are areas where in the modern world plague is known to exist, and you'll notice that that includes the United States, particularly west of the Rocky Mountains, where you still find the naturally occurring presence of bubonic plague, particularly in, not so much in rats, but other rodents, groundhogs, squirrels, that kind of thing. And as recently as 2012, just last year, there was actually a case of a girl in Colorado who was infected by the bubonic plague. And fortunately, she survived because, of course, now the great advantage that we have is that bubonic plague can be treated directly through the application of antibiotics. So it's a very treatable disease now, whereas, even 100 years ago, it was a death sentence. So, for example, in 1855, there was an outbreak of bubonic plague in India, which resulted in the deaths of something like 12 million people. And that might sound like a long time ago, but it's really just a little more than a century and a half, where you see that the shift in the elimination of these diseases, such as smallpox, which was eradicated entirely, or bubonic plague, which is now isolated and treatable, I think is one of the big changes of the modern world. But one of the big changes of the medieval world, perhaps the biggest impact of the bubonic plague in political world, was the demise of the Mongol Empire, which by the middle of the 14th century, after its founding by Genghis Khan, had actually broken up into smaller territories, federally administered kind of districts, almost sort of harking back to the old Persian model of the satraps, but was still nominally controlled in the east by the Great Khan, the descendant of Genghis Khan, and the empire that was founded in China, the Yuan Dynasty, founded by the grandson of Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan. And this empire collapses very rapidly. Again, it takes the kind of the power of a biomedical disaster to sweep aside the greatest empire in world history at that time. There was no real, ultimately, military challenge to the Mongol Empire, but it collapsed internally because of this pandemic. If we move further west to Europe, I mentioned the persecution of the Jews, and of course, I think it's tempting to see a direct connection between these sort of horrific scenes that are even shown in medieval manuscripts, such as the burning of Jewish populations, and to connect that to more recent history, particularly under the Nazis with the Holocaust. And I think there is certainly a connection to be made. But I don't want to push that too far in this class because I think we're dealing here with great stretches of time. And I think what's interesting about the Jewish case was that within Europe at the time, the Jews were really the only major religious minority who were visible, who were different than some of their neighbors, their Christian neighbors, and who were therefore scapegoated because, of course, there was no scientific understanding of the origins of the Black Death. So, for example, there were Jews rounded up, essentially tortured, and made to sign confessions saying that they were to blame for poisoning the wells, the drinking wells, which the theory went was the source of the Black Death. And again, it's an interesting phenomenon, this Jewish persecution. It was not new, but I think it really was ignited by the Black Death. And you find it particularly pronounced in regions which will be associated with this habit of violence in later generations. So, for example, in the Rhine River Valley, the river that cuts through the borderlands of France and Germany, you saw the most violent religious persecution and genocide being perpetrated against the Jews of that area of Europe, which was very settled, very urban. And then 150 odd years later, you see a wave of witch hunts, witch persecutions. These are basically kind of religious paranoia, but this time triggered at allegations of people engaging in sorcery and black magic. And this is taking place against the backdrop of religious war and upheaval in late medieval Europe. But I think it's very interesting that where you see the witch hunts at their most pronounced 150 years later is also where you see this wave of persecutions, lynchings, and killings of Jewish inhabitants. So there does seem to be a kind of pattern there. And of course, if you go forward centuries later, of course, you see in Germany the rise of Nazi Europe. But it's important to recognize that this was not localized entirely to one particular area, but this was widespread throughout continental Europe. And also carried through the tradition of, sort of persecution that we saw during the Crusades as well. In England, you see an interesting moment, which is referred to somewhat confusingly as the Peasants Revolt, because this makes it sound like only peasants were involved in this revolution, essentially an uprising, political uprising. Now, if you look at the year that this took place, this is actually a generation or so after the time of the Black Death. But what we're dealing with here is the long-term economic fallout consequences of the wake of the plague. And one of those was a real challenge to the entrenched medieval system of feudalism, which by the time of the Black Death, to be fair, was already in decline, but the epidemic certainly put the nail in its coffin. So before the advent of Bubonic Plague, certainly in Western Europe, but in England in particular, land was very expensive. There were a small minority of aristocrats, landowners, who owned a disproportionately huge percentage of the land in England, and this was how wealth was measured in an agrarian society. It was how much land you owned. Now, at the same time, labor was very cheap. This is peasant labor. Peasants were considered to be almost overabundant before the Black Death. It's rather strange to think of a population of a few million people in Great Britain at that time representing the verges of overpopulation. But certainly there were a lot of peasants for the amount of land that was available, and their labor was valued very low. And very often they were tied to the land in a form of slavery, referred to as serfdom. After the Black Death, this equation is flipped. Land becomes very cheap, and labor becomes very expensive. And this is because there are so many people that have died that not only are laborers scarcer on the ground, but many of the landowners themselves have been killed off by the plague, and therefore their estates are sitting vacant and are subject to purchase and eventual social mobility for the peasantry. And this is a new situation, and this is something that the established elites in England were very disturbed by, this new social mobility of the peasant classes particularly the landowning peasants, who were starting to work their way up in the social ladder. And so the government at the time, under the monarchy of Richard II, who you can see depicted in this illustration here, the foot of the picture, introduced a series of measures which included high punitive taxes, property taxes, artificial wage caps, which were designed to limit the amount that labourer could charge for his or her, working on the land. And so this created this kind of what was referred to as a peasants' revolt, although it was actually led in many cases by other more educated people at the time. To be a peasant meant that you were essentially uneducated, that you had no access to education. What's interesting about the Peasants' Revolt is its leadership. Many of them actually came from the merchant classes, or even the radical clergy. These were people who had a stake in society, but felt that through the kind of freeing of market forces that they could actually gain more, or that they were concerned with issues of social justice. So this was not entirely led by the peasants, but you can see here the reaction to this revolt was one of violent persecution. And although the revolt was successfully defeated by the government of the day, I think the forces that were unleashed by the Black Death were never able to be turned back. The cork couldn't be put back into the bottle. Now in China you see what amounts to a successful peasants' revolt, and of course when a peasants' revolt becomes successful, it becomes a revolution. And this is actually what happens in the Ming Dynasty in China. You can see here the founder of the Ming Dynasty, Ming in Chinese meaning enlightened. This was the Hongwu emperor, the founder of the Ming Dynasty in 1368. And what's significant about this uprising is it is the overthrow of the Yuan dynasty, which was basically isolated after the beginnings of the collapse of the Mongol Empire. And you see the infrastructure of China, which the Mongols have been so successful in preserving and expanding during the period of the Yuan dynasty, actually fall into disrepair. So, for example, the great canal networks that kind of irrigated Chinese agriculture, which served as a main route of transportation and commerce, they actually silted up because there were no longer enough workers to clean out the canals. Now what this meant was when the rains came, there were some devastating floods which destroyed farmland in the Yellow River Valley, created the dispossession of many millions, and hundreds of thousands of Chinese peasants were actually drowned in these floods. So you have this sort of environmental catastrophe on top of the biomedical catastrophe, and many of the Chinese people at that time looked to their government to embody this notion of the mandate of heaven, which we already talked about, as the kind of intermediary between heaven and earth. And so the Yuan dynasty was seen as having lost the mandate of heaven. And although it was a very efficient empire in many ways, or an efficient dynasty, and introduced a great deal of economic and political reform, the Yuan dynasty was always regarded by the vast majority of the ethnic Han Chinese as being a foreign dominant empire, that this was a foreign occupation. So they were quite glad in 1368 to rise up and to eventually rid themselves of the Mongols. And the Ming Empire, the Ming Dynasty of China, becomes one of the great empires of great dynasties of Chinese history. It becomes associated initially with the opening up of foreign trade routes, particularly in the Indian Ocean, and this is just leading up to the period of Columbus. But eventually you see this initial expansion of the Mings being replaced with a more isolationist position. And I think, just to leave off this lecture, I think it's an interesting point to consider what would have happened if the Chinese, rather than the Europeans, had led the way in global expansion during the 15th century. Thanks very much.